Chapter 6. The trap line Jim had laid out for himself was close to 75 miles in extent. Over this broad stretch of woods and water he would have absolute domain for the next 7 months. The line ran from his home camp 30 miles or more down the squaw to the lower camp he had visited with Lindsay. Thence it doubled back up the river as far as Beaver Lake Portage. From Beaver Lake there was a trail south to Porcupine River, and he planned to have traps all the way up that stream to Porcupine Lake. From there the trail led northward to Whitefish Lake and so back to his home cabin. Lindsay's line was shorter, but still a big territory for a 16-year-old to cover. Its route was down Poplar Lake, through Grave Lake and Upper Squaw Lake, then across to Sucker Lake and back into the lower end of Squaw Lake. The round trip would take in about 40 miles. Jim rose very early the morning of the 30th and set out before daybreak for Whitefish Lake. From its northern end he cut through the bush on foot and followed the bank of the Porcupine River for several hours. A little after noon he found what he was looking for, a camping site close to the stream. The boy built a small fire and ate a few mouthfuls of cold lunch, washing them down with a cup of tea. Then he spit on his hands and picked up the axe. In the next hour he felled and trimmed half a dozen straight spruce poles and cut them even lengths and began notching the ends for a log house. The cabin he built was extremely simple. It had no windows and one open side. The roof was made of small poles notched and held in place with nails he had brought in his pack-sack. When a thick layer of boughs had been laid over them in the form of thatch, and the crevices had been chinked with moss, he had a stout and fairly weather-tight shelter. The cabin was not finished till well into the morning of the next day, and he had to push along steadily to cover the 15 miles back to his home camp by nightfall. The weather had been milder the past 2 days. A red-streaked sunset promised another fair day on the morrow, and he looked forward eagerly to setting his traps. If no more ice formed, he'd be able to use the canoe. Jim got up long before dawn. By the time the first gray lighted the east, he was dressed and built his fire up and eaten a hearty breakfast. Then, stowing his rifle, axe, snowshoes, bedroll, and a few supplies, and a bag of frozen fish in the canoe, he pushed off down the river. By now he had an accurate plan of the whole trap line in his mind, and he wasted no time in hunting for the cubbies. Pulling into shore at the first one, he tied a piece of fish 5 or 6 inches above the end of the slant approach log, then pushed down the spring of the trap and set the trigger. When the open trap was laid in a notch at the top of the log, he sprinkled the pan with a dusting of light snow. His hands in skin mittens rubbed with oil from rat musks left no human scent. Working as fast as possible, he moved on from one cubby to the next, along both banks of the river. Sometimes the traps were only a little distance apart. Again he might cover a mile or more without coming to a trap house. At noon he cast a hurried glance aloft and saw a cold sky all the way to the horizon. No time to eat lunch. He went on setting traps till the first flakes of the storm whirled by in a sudden gust of wind. About 3 in the afternoon it started to snow in earnest. The sky, the hurrying river, and the bush all were blotted out in a swirling veil of white. Jim was nearing the head of the long portage. He made 1 or 2 more sets, hampered by the blinding snow, and steered his canoe across the current, paddling more by instinct than by sight. A short distance from the end of the carry there was a little camp, a pole and bark lean-to that would give him some sort of shelter from the storm. He hauled the canoe out and overturned it, carrying his duffel up the bank. To his joy, there was a good-sized pile of firewood in the lee of the hut. The lean-to had one open side that faced south, out of the wind. A few yards away there was a huge butt log half burned through. Jim shaved a dry stick of pine with his knife and laid a heap of split kindling beside it, and sheltering the flame of a match under his mackinaw. The tiny blaze struggled with the snow and wind and sank almost to nothing, then flared again and caught in the shavings. He fed the fire stick by stick till it was strong enough to hold its own. When it was roaring hungrily, he went back into the woods and cut another dead tree. Plenty of fuel was a first essential in an open camp. He would have to keep the fire up all night. Fresh boughs for the bed came next, then supper. He toasted some bread, made a kettle of cocoa, and opened a can of corned beef hash for the occasion. After he had eaten, he sat for a while in the door of his shelter and watching the hissing flames. He was warm and out of the wind. The red glow of the fire lighted a narrow circle walled by steadily falling snow. It was like a cozy room, completely shut off from the night and the storm. When he grew sleepy, Jim piled logs in the blaze and crawled into his eiderdown. He woke twice in the night to look at the fire and put on more wood. A sort of a woodsman's sixth sense aroused him when this was necessary. There was no real dawn the next morning, simply a graying of the night to show dim outlines of trees through the snow-filled air. Jim whistled to keep up his spirits as he rebuilt the fire. It was too bad. This storm at the very beginning of the season, when every day counted. Still, you had to learn patience if you were a trapper. Weather wasn't something that could be hurried. He spent the day as best he could, mending a break in one of his snowshoes, cutting more wood, cooking himself sparing meals. His provision was beginning to run low. That night, just before he drowsed off to sleep, there came a change. The wind eddied lightly across the door of the hut, and he saw a star twinkling through the trees. The storm was over. Jim rose early, eager to be off. When he pushed his axe handle into the dry snow, it sank down to within a few inches of its head, 2 feet deep. He went to the river for a kettle of water and saw slush blocking the current. That was too bad. He knew the canoe would hardly move in that sluggish mess. Nevertheless, when he had eaten, he launched the craft and made a try at it. No use. The bow crept forward a few yards, driven by powerful strokes of the paddle, then came to a standstill. The narrow lane of water behind him closed up again, and he had to labor for 5 minutes to regain the bank. There was nothing for it but to haul out the canoe and put on his snowshoes. Jim had used the last of his food for breakfast. He would have to get back to his home camp and leave the lower end of the line unset. As the sun rose, it grew warmer, and the snow was soft and sticky. The boy plodded along the shore, zigzagging to avoid thickets and making his own trail as he went. Such traps as he passed were still undisturbed. Once or twice he found the bait stolen, probably by those perennial thieves, the Canadian jay. But no fur bearers had ventured out during the storm. Lag-weary and wet with perspiration, Jim hauled in at his main camp just before sunset. The first thing he did was heat a kettle of water and give himself a sketchy bath. A change of underwear felt good, and a supper of fried moose meat and potatoes made his physical comfort complete. In the night he woke to hear heavy drops of drumming on the roof. A steady, warm rain fell on the camp all the next day, melting the snow and raising the level of the water. When Jim rose on the morning of the 5th, he found the air clear and sharp, and the river no longer clogged with slush. It was a day for action. He packed his knapsack with provisions and sat down beside the shore once more. This time the going was better. The snow packed down by the rain and thinly crushed over gave firmer footing. He looked at the traps again as he went. In the first 5 or 6 there was no signs of fur. Then he saw a narrow track, frozen in the crust, leading towards one of his cubbies. Too small for a mink, but he followed eagerly. When the snow-covered trap house came in sight, he thought at first there was nothing in there. Then, against the blanket of white, he saw two black specks. An ermine, caught by both front legs, was glaring at him with steady hate in those shoe-button eyes. The slim white body, blending perfectly with the snow, had been invisible at 5 paces. He killed it with a quick, merciful blow on the skull, and put the limp body in his pack-sack and reset the trap. Before he reached the lean-to at the head of the portage, he was rewarded by 2 more of the little white weasels. Not a big day's catch, but at least a start. There was enough daylight left to carry the canoe over the 2-mile trail and return to the shelter to sleep. It grew steadily colder in the night. Jim found the water in his tea kettle frozen to a solid block of ice when he started to get breakfast. The temperature must be down to below 0. He packed the rest of his duffel on his back and hurried across the portage. The current was running fast below the rapids, and there was still open water there 3 or 4 feet from the bank. Jim got the canoe in and started down. He set the first half-dozen of traps without difficulty, but 2 miles below he came to a pool where the river was frozen from shore to shore. He succeeded in breaking a path through the thin ice and hauled out in the snow. A half-mile hike along the bank showed him that it was useless to go further in the canoe. The big freeze had come at last. He would be lucky to get his craft back to the portage. Hurrying on afoot, he set traps as far as he dared along the north side of the river. The cubbies on the other shore would have to go unattended for a while. It was late when Jim paddled the last few strokes that sent the bow up on the ice at the foot of the long carry. He lifted the canoe to his shoulders and hastened along the rapidly darkening trail. Tired, hungry, and cold, he slid and stumbled in the icy footing. That 2 miles had never seemed so long. When he thought he had made half the carry, he set down his load for a minute's rest. A windless night, still and sharp. Across the southwest sky there was a still glow of red, and against it the spruce branches hung an inky black silhouette. Miles along through the silent brush he heard a coyote howl. A shiver shook him. He grunted, disgusted with himself. Might think I was a greenhorn, getting the shakes when a little bush wolf hollers. He swung the canoe up and plodded along. When he reached the cabin, the stars were out. More and more the river was frozen over as Jim hiked westward next morning. At one place he was able to cross over on the new ice, so clear and black that he could see the boulders in the stream bed beneath him. In this way he looked at his traps along the south bank on his route to main camp. 2 ermine were added to the 3 already in his pack, and in the last trap he visited he found the frozen body of a mink. This was a real catch, a big fellow in prime fur. Jim felt its deep, silky softness and figured he would get $12 or $13 for that pelt. As he neared his home camp, he was watching the river for another stretch of solid ice. He still had to get back onto the north side. Up ahead he saw a place where the stream seemed to be frozen across, but to reach it he had to circle off to the left around a dense spruce thicket that lined the bank. It was just as he came in sight of the river again that he saw something moving along the trees on the far shore. The boy stood still as a statue, all of his senses alert. A couple 100 yards upstream, a big grayish-brown shape drifted out of the shadow of the woods. It walked out onto the frozen river, lifting splayed hooves daintily. Huge antlers thrust upward and backwards from its head, and its nose was raised to test the wind. Jim had seen caribou before, but never so close as this one. An old bull, he judged, from the strong neck and the sweep of the gray-white mane. He held his breath as 2 more caribou followed their leader onto the ice. They were smaller and lighter in build, with a narrower spread of antlers. A pair of cows. The cow caribou, he remembered, was different from all the other members of the deer family. She grew horns after the first year and never shed them. The boy did not stir until all three had made their way across the frozen surface. Caribou were protected game, but he couldn't help casting a regretful look after them. That big bull was offering a tempting mark for a rifle. Continuing up the shore, he came to the place where their tracks led off to the south. Well, his question about where to cross had been answered. He was soon on the north bank and headed for home.